August 15, 1945, victory over Japan Day. Across America, sirens wailed in celebration and confetti rained from office buildings as crowds filled the streets in spontaneous jubilation. In prisoner of war camps from California to Texas, Japanese soldiers and support personnel prepared for repatriation to their defeated homeland. But in a small women's facility outside Sacramento, something unprecedented was happening. When American guards served breakfast to a group of Japanese women prisoners that morning, the women stared at their plates in silent disbelief. Fried eggs with golden yolks, thick slices of pink ham glistening with fat, toast slathered with real butter, coffee with cream and sugar. It was more food than most of them had seen in a single meal in years. 23-year-old Masako Kimura sat frozen before her plate, her hands trembling in her lap. She had been a military nurse, trained to endure hardship without complaint, to serve the emperor with discipline and sacrifice. She had eaten rice mixed with sawdust during the final months before her capture. She had watched patients die from malnutrition in field hospitals where medical supplies had dwindled to nothing. And now her American captors, the demons she had been taught to fear, were serving her what they casually called breakfast. "Festival food," whispered Hisako Yoshida beside her, using the Japanese term for the elaborate meals prepared only for New Year's celebrations and the most important occasions. Her voice carried a mixture of confusion and something that might have been fear. The 42 women in the mess hall remained motionless, their military training warring with their hunger. Was this some kind of trick? A final meal before execution? American propaganda designed to humiliate them by displaying the wealth and abundance of their conquerors. Private Vernon Hayes, a lanky farm boy from Iowa with freckles across his sunburned nose, noticed their hesitation. He picked up his own plate and fork, demonstrating in the exaggerated gestures of someone trying to communicate across a language barrier. "It's okay," he said slowly, smiling with the earnest openness of someone who had never learned to hide his thoughts. "It's just breakfast. We eat like this every morning." Just breakfast. The word seemed impossible to comprehend. Masako had grown up in modest circumstances in Kyoto, where her family had considered themselves fortunate to have rice with pickled vegetables and perhaps a small piece of fish for their morning meal. The quantity of protein on this single plate would have fed her entire family for days. She looked around at her fellow prisoners too, seeing her own confusion reflected in their faces. They had been captured 3 months earlier in the Philippines as American forces advanced through the Pacific Islands. They had been transport nurses and communications operators, administrative personnel, and supply coordinators. Young women who had believed they were serving their country's noble defense against Western aggression. They had been taught that Americans were brutal monsters who would torture and kill their prisoners. Instead, they had been given clean barracks with real beds, medical care when they were sick. And now this impossible breakfast. Captain Ruth Caldwell stood at the entrance to the mess hall, watching the scene with an expression Masako couldn't quite read. The American officer had treated them with firm but respectful dignity since their arrival, never raising her voice, never showing the cruelty they had been taught to expect. But this breakfast felt like something more than simple prisoner rations. It felt like a message Masako wasn't sure she was ready to understand. November 1944. 3 months before that impossible breakfast would change everything. The transport truck carrying the first group of Japanese women prisoners rolled through the gates of the makeshift facility outside Sacramento, California. Unlike the massive compounds housing thousands of male prisoners, this smaller installation had been hastily converted from an agricultural processing facility. Wooden barracks lined the perimeter, surrounded by wire fencing and guard towers that seemed almost apologetic in their construction. Masako Kimura stepped down from the truck with the rigid posture drilled into her through years of military training. At 23, she had served as a nurse for the Imperial Japanese Army for 18 months, stationed first in Manila and later in the field hospitals of Leyte. Her uniform, once crisp gray with the Red Cross armband of medical personnel, now hung loose on her diminished frame. Around her, 41 other women descended in silence, their faces carefully composed masks of dignity despite their circumstances. They were daughters of the Empire, taught from childhood that sacrifice for the Emperor was the highest form of honor. Masako had volunteered for military nursing, believing the propaganda she'd absorbed since grammar school. America was the aggressor. Japan fought a defensive war against Western imperialism. The Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere would bring liberation to Asian peoples oppressed by colonial powers. She had believed every word with the fervent certainty of youth. Captain Ruth Caldwell watched the women assemble with an expression of professional assessment mixed with something softer. She was 38 years old, a career military officer who had spent most of her service managing logistics rather than prisoners. The War Department had given her this assignment with minimal guidance. House them. Feed them. Prepare them for eventual repatriation. Nobody had explained how to bridge the cultural chasm between American guards and Japanese prisoners who barely shared a common language. Among the new arrivals, Hisako Yoshida stood with particular stiffness. At 26, she had worked as a communications officer, managing radio transmissions between field units and command centers. She spoke some English, learned during her education at a missionary school in Osaka before the war, though she had no intention of revealing this skill to her captors. Knowledge was power, and she intended to gather intelligence about American intentions before showing any cooperation. The women were processed through standard intake procedures. Their few remaining possessions were cataloged and stored. They were assigned barracks numbers and shown to sleeping quarters that seemed almost luxurious compared to the crowded field conditions they'd endured before capture. Real mattresses, not rice straw mats. Blankets that smelled of soap rather than mildew. Windows with intact glass. Chiyoko Tanaka, a 19-year-old supply clerk who had been the youngest member of their unit, whispered to Masako as they stood in their assigned barracks, "Why are they treating us like this? Where is the brutality we were warned about?" Masako had no answer. She had seen American soldiers in combat, had treated wounded prisoners from both sides in field hospitals. But this organized civility, this systematic provision of comfort to defeated enemies, contradicted everything she thought she understood about her captors. Winter descended on Northern California with a dampness that seeped into bones accustomed to different climates. The Japanese women settled into routines that felt simultaneously familiar and alien. Morning formation, work assignments. Meals taken in supervised silence. Evening return to barracks. The structure resembled military life, yet stripped of purpose or meaning. Masako found herself assigned to the camp's small medical facility, working under the supervision of Dr. William Gardner, a middle-aged physician from San Francisco, who treated her with professional courtesy that never quite reached warmth. He spoke slowly and used simple words, demonstrating procedures rather than explaining them. She understood more than she let on, her year of English study in secondary school providing basic comprehension even if she rarely spoke. The other women received various assignments. Hisako worked in the administrative offices, filing paperwork and organizing records. Chiyoko helped in the kitchen, peeling vegetables and washing dishes under the watchful eye of the head cook, a heavy-set woman named Betty who seemed perpetually annoyed by everyone regardless of nationality. The work was neither difficult nor meaningful, simply a way to fill the empty hours between morning and night. The prisoners kept to themselves during free periods, gathering in small groups to speak in hushed Japanese. They were careful about what they said, aware that someone might understand their language even if none of the guards appeared to. They talked about home, about families they hadn't heard from in months, about the war news they overheard in fragments. By December 1944, it was becoming clear that Japan was losing. though none of them would say this directly. Private Vernon Hayes walked his guard rotations with the easy gait of someone accustomed to open spaces. He had grown up on a farm outside Cedar Rapids, Iowa, the youngest of 4 brothers. 2 of his siblings were fighting in Europe. He had been assigned to stateside duty after a training injury left him with a permanent limp, too slight to discharge him, but enough to keep him from combat deployment. He watched the Japanese women with curiosity rather than hostility, seeing in their careful movements and disciplined routines something that reminded him of his own sisters. Sergeant Thomas Lim supervised the guard rotations with quiet efficiency. His parents had emigrated from Guangdong Province 2 decades earlier, settling in San Francisco's Chinatown, where they ran a small restaurant. He understood something the other guards didn't, that these Japanese women were as foreign to American culture as his own parents had been upon arrival. He saw their confusion masked as dignity, their fear disguised as military bearing. The days grew shorter. Rain fell in steady sheets that turned the compound into a maze of mud and wooden walkways. The women moved through their routines like ghosts, present but not quite real, existing in a liminal space between their old lives and whatever uncertain future awaited them. They had been told nothing about repatriation timelines. They received no mail from home. They existed in a gray present tense with no clear path forward or back. February 19th, 1945. The morning dawned cold and clear after 3 days of rain. Masako reported to the medical facility at dawn, as usual, but instead of Dr. Gardner, she found Private Hayes waiting outside, looking uncertain and concerned. He gestured toward the building with awkward urgency, his limited vocabulary making explanation difficult. "Sick," he managed. "Woman. Very sick." Inside, Masako found Chiyoko curled on an examination table, her face flushed with fever and her breathing shallow. The young woman had been fighting a respiratory infection for weeks, but had hidden the worsening symptoms out of fear that showing weakness would bring punishment. By the time she collapsed during breakfast preparation, the infection had settled deep in her lungs. Dr. Gardner arrived within minutes and immediately began treatment, but his expression told Masako that the situation was serious. For 3 days, Masako stayed at Chiyoko's bedside, monitoring her vital signs and administering medication under Dr. Gardner's supervision. The American physician worked with focused intensity, showing no less concern for this enemy prisoner than he would for one of his own soldiers. He explained his treatments to Masako in careful English, trusting her competence even across the language barrier. Private Hayes stopped by regularly, bringing extra blankets and hot tea made from herbs he said his grandmother had taught him about. On the 4th morning, Chiyoko's fever broke. She opened her eyes with clarity for the first time in days, looking up at Masako with confusion and relief. "You stayed," she whispered in Japanese. "I thought when I got sick they would let me die. That's what we were told they would do." Masako had no response. She had believed the same propaganda, yet here was Dr. Gardner, who had worked through the night to save an enemy prisoner's life. Here was Private Hayes, who had brought comfort items without being asked. Here was a medical facility as well equipped as any she had worked in during her service. That afternoon, Private Hayes appeared at the medical facility carrying a covered plate. He set it down on the side table near Chiyoko's bed and lifted the cover with the pride of someone presenting a great gift. 2 fried eggs, their yolks perfectly golden, 3 thick slices of ham still steaming, toast with butter melting into its surface, a small bowl of sliced peaches in syrup. "My ma always said the best medicine is a good breakfast," he explained in his slow, careful English. "Figured your girl here could use some real food after all that fever." He demonstrated eating with exaggerated motions, encouraging Chiyoko to try it. Chiyoko stared at the plate, as if it might vanish if she blinked. She looked to Masako for permission or explanation, her eyes wide with disbelief. Masako found herself equally stunned. This wasn't standard prisoner rations. This was someone's personal food shared without expectation of gratitude or recognition. This was kindness. Private Hayes left the medical facility with an awkward wave, his mission of mercy complete. Masako and Chiyoko sat in silence, staring at the breakfast plate as if it were an artifact from another world. Steam rose from the eggs in delicate wisps. The ham glistened with rendered fat. The butter had melted completely into the toast, leaving golden pools in its surface. "Is it poisoned?" Chiyoko whispered in Japanese, giving voice to the fear both women shared. "Is this how they kill us? Make us trust them first?" Masako had no answer. She had watched Dr. Gardner work tirelessly to save Chiyoko's life. She had seen genuine concern in Private Hayes's freckled face, but years of propaganda didn't dissolve in days of kind treatment. The lessons of childhood ran deeper than rational observation. Americans were cruel. Americans were demons. Americans tortured their prisoners and celebrated their suffering. Yet here was breakfast that looked like festival food, offered freely to a sick enemy. Dr. Gardner returned to check on his patient and noticed the untouched plate. He smiled, the first genuine warmth Masako had seen from him. "Good. Vernon finally got his act together. Girl needs protein to fight that infection." He made eating motions, encouraging Chiyoko the same way Private Hayes had. "Eat. Medicine." His simple English carried unmistakable sincerity. After he left, Chiyoko reached for the fork with trembling hands. She cut a small piece of egg, watching the yolk bleed across the white. She brought it to her mouth slowly, as if expecting pain. Instead, her eyes widened with shock. The egg was warm and rich, seasoned with salt and pepper. She had never tasted anything quite like it. In Japan, eggs were precious, often eaten raw or barely cooked. This American preparation transformed the simple ingredient into something luxurious. She tried the ham next, and tears began streaming down her face. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization of abundance. This much meat would have fed her entire family for days back home. Here, it was casual breakfast food given to a sick prisoner without ceremony or expectation. The contrast between what she had been taught to expect and what she was experiencing shattered something fundamental in her understanding of the world. Masako watched her young friend weep over American breakfast and felt her own eyes burning with unshed tears. She thought about the patients she had treated in field hospitals, soldiers dying from malnutrition and infected wounds because supplies had stopped arriving. She thought about the propaganda broadcasts that promised victory while cities starved. She thought about how completely she had believed the lies about American brutality. "They're not demons," Chiyoko said between bites, her voice barely audible. "Everything we were told was wrong." Masako nodded slowly, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. She had spent months in this facility expecting cruelty that never came. She had witnessed professional medical care, adequate housing, respectful treatment. But this breakfast, this simple act of sharing food with a sick enemy, somehow cut through her defenses more effectively than any amount of correct procedure. Someone had cared enough to bring his own food. Someone had seen Chiyoko as a person worth nourishing back to health. Word of Chiyoko's remarkable breakfast spread through the women's barracks with the speed of all significant news in confined spaces. That evening, after work assignments ended and the prisoners gathered in their free time, the conversations buzzed with speculation and disbelief. Hisako translated the story for those whose English was too limited to have understood the details, and with each retelling, the significance of the gesture grew larger. "Festival food," the women kept repeating, using the Japanese term matsuri ryori, the kind of elaborate meals prepared only for New Year's celebrations, weddings, or the most important occasions. Eggs and meat in such abundance seemed impossible as daily fare. Surely this was exceptional treatment, something special arranged for a sick prisoner. The alternative, that Americans actually ate this way every morning, seemed too fantastical to believe. But over the following days, as Chiyoko recovered and returned to regular camp routines, the women began Observing the American guards more carefully during meal times, they watched through the mess hall windows as soldiers lined up for breakfast service. They saw the same generous portions, the same fried eggs and ham, the same toast with butter, sometimes bacon instead of ham, sometimes potatoes as well. The abundance wasn't exceptional, it was ordinary. Masako found herself struggling to reconcile this observation with everything she knew about wartime conditions. Japan had been rationing food severely for years. Even before her military service, her family in Kyoto had lived on reduced portions, rice mixed with barley to stretch supplies, vegetables and pickles, occasional fish. Meat was a luxury reserved for special occasions. Her time in military service had been even more austere, with rations growing smaller as supply lines broke down. Yet America, fighting a war across two oceans, maintaining millions of soldiers in the field, somehow had enough surplus to feed its prisoners better than Japan fed its own citizens. The implications were staggering and deeply uncomfortable. If America possessed such overwhelming abundance, how could Japan ever have hoped to win this war? What had their leaders been thinking when they attacked Pearl Harbor? Sergeant Thomas Lim noticed the increased attention from the prisoners during mealtimes. Unlike the other guards, he understood something about the cultural shock these women were experiencing. His own parents had arrived in America with almost nothing, fleeing poverty and instability in China. He remembered his mother's tears the first time she saw a fully stocked American grocery store, overwhelmed by the variety and plenty after years of scarcity. He began a small experiment. During his guard rotations near the mess hall, he made sure the Japanese women could observe the cooking process. He arranged for them to see the storage areas where food was kept, the walk-in refrigerators packed with meat and dairy, the pantries stocked with flour and sugar and coffee. He wanted them to understand that this wasn't propaganda or deception. This was simply American reality. The effect was profound. The women stopped whispering about poison or tricks. Instead, they began asking questions in broken English. "Every day?" they would ask, pointing at the breakfast service. "All Americans?" Sergeant Lim would nod, confirming what they could barely believe. Every day, all Americans. This was normal. March brought warmer weather and a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the camp. The gray months of winter isolation were giving way to something more complex. Sergeant Thomas Lim had been watching the Japanese women carefully, seeing past their disciplined facades to the confusion and curiosity beneath. He understood displacement in ways the other guards didn't. His parents had navigated a foreign culture while maintaining their Chinese identity. These women faced an even more difficult challenge, forced to reconcile their beliefs about America with the reality they were experiencing. He approached Captain Ruth Caldwell with a proposal. "Ma'am, I'd like permission to start some informal English lessons for the prisoners. Focus on practical vocabulary, especially around daily activities like meals. Might help reduce tension and improve communication." The captain considered this for a moment before nodding approval. Anything that made the camp run more smoothly was worth attempting. Sergeant Lim began his lessons in the mess hall during free periods. He started with the most practical subject he could imagine, food. He brought in actual ingredients, holding up eggs and teaching the word slowly. "Egg, this is an egg." Then he demonstrated cooking terminology through pantomime and simple phrases. Fry the egg, boil the egg, scramble the egg. The women watched with intense concentration, repeating the words in their careful, accented English. Masako attended every lesson, hungry for language skills that would help her communicate more effectively with Dr. Gardner. Her previous English education had focused on reading and grammar, not conversational fluency. Sergeant Lim's practical approach filled gaps she hadn't realized existed. More importantly, his patient teaching style never made her feel inferior or stupid. He treated mistakes as natural parts of learning rather than failures. Hisako participated with visible reluctance at first, suspicious of anything that felt like collaboration with the enemy. But practical necessity overcame ideological resistance. Understanding her captor's language meant better comprehending her situation. She discovered she had an aptitude for American idioms, though the logic behind expressions like sunny side up and over easy seemed bizarre. The lessons evolved beyond simple vocabulary. Sergeant Lim brought in a hot plate and began demonstrating actual cooking techniques. He showed them how Americans prepared eggs, the importance of butter and seasoning, the different textures achieved through various methods. The women watched with fascination as he cracked eggs into a pan with casual confidence, something most of them had never been permitted to do with such a precious ingredient. In America, he explained in his careful, teaching voice, breakfast is important. We believe starting the day with good food gives you strength for work. He gestured at the generous portions. This isn't special treatment. This is normal. Every American family tries to eat this way. Private Hayes joined some of the lessons, demonstrating his mother's techniques for perfect fried eggs. You want the butter hot, but not smoking, he explained. His Iowa accent thick, but his meaning clear through demonstration. Crack the egg, gentle-like. Let it cook slow. That's how you get the white set, but the yolk still soft. The women began practicing with actual ingredients under supervision, their initial nervousness giving way to concentration and then satisfaction as they successfully prepared American-style eggs. For many of them, this was the first time they had been trusted with valuable food resources since their capture. April brought cherry blossoms to the ornamental trees planted around the facility's perimeter, their delicate pink petals a painful reminder of home. The women gathered beneath the trees during their free time, watching the blossoms fall with expressions of profound longing. In Japan, Hanami season was a time for celebration and reflection. Here it only emphasized how far they were from everything familiar. Masako had been writing letters to her family in Kyoto since her capture, carefully composed messages that followed Red Cross guidelines. She wrote about her work in the medical facility, about being well treated, about hoping for their health and safety. She mentioned nothing about the abundance of food or the kindness of her captors, knowing such details might be censored as propaganda. She addressed each letter to her parents' home in the Higashiyama district and waited for responses that never came. She wasn't alone in this experience. Every woman in the facility had written home and none had received replies. At first, they assumed delays were normal, given the chaos of war. Mail between enemy nations had to route through neutral countries and Red Cross channels. Weeks of delay made sense. But weeks had turned into months, and still nothing arrived. The silence became its own form of torture, worse in some ways than the physical hardships they had endured before capture. Hisako sat with Masako beneath the cherry trees one afternoon, watching petals drift across the compound. "My brother was in Osaka," she said quietly in Japanese, using the past tense without seeming to realize it. "He worked in a factory near the port. My parents lived just north of the city center. I keep writing to their address, but I don't know if there's anything left to write to." They had been hearing fragments of news about the American bombing campaign against Japanese cities. The guards didn't discuss it openly, but newspapers left in common areas contained articles about air raids on Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe. The language was sanitized, talking about strategic targets and military objectives, but the women could read between the lines. Their cities were burning, their families were dying or displaced. The country they had served was being systematically destroyed. Chiyoko had stopped writing letters entirely. Her family lived in Tokyo, in a neighborhood she knew had been hit hard during the massive firebombing raid in March. She had read about it in an American newspaper that Sergeant Lim had quietly left where she could find it. Tens of thousands dead in a single night. Square miles of the city reduced to ash. She couldn't bring herself to write another letter that might be addressed to ghosts. Captain Caldwell understood the impact of this prolonged silence on her prisoner's mental state. She contacted Red Cross officials, requesting any information about the families of her charges. The response was blunt and devastating. Communications with Japan had become nearly impossible as the war reached its final stages. Entire cities had been evacuated or destroyed. Even if the families were alive, locating them would be extremely difficult and would likely remain impossible until after Japan's surrender. May brought newspapers that Captain Caldwell wished she could have hidden from her prisoners. As Allied forces advanced deeper into Japanese-held territories, war correspondents sent back photographs and reports that painted an increasingly grim picture of Japan's final stand. The images appeared in American papers with headlines about imminent victory, but for the Japanese women, they were windows into a nightmare they had helped create. Masako found a newspaper in the common room that someone had left on a table. She picked it up, her English now proficient enough to read most articles without difficulty. The front page showed photographs from Okinawa, Japanese civilians jumping from cliffs rather than face American capture, mothers holding their children as they leapt. The caption explained they had been told Americans would torture and kill them, so they chose death instead. She sat down heavily, the newspaper trembling in her hands. These were her people, her countrymen, dying because they believed the same lies she had believed. How many of them might have survived if they had known the truth, if they had understood that American soldiers were more likely to offer them breakfast than brutality? The weight of this realization pressed against her chest until she couldn't breathe properly. Hisako found her there and read the article over her shoulder. Her face went pale as she absorbed the photographs and their implications. "We believed this," she whispered in Japanese. "When we were captured, I thought about killing myself. I had a plan. I was just too afraid to follow through." She looked at Masako with anguished eyes. How many women did follow through? How many died because they believed what we believed? Other prisoners gathered around the newspaper, drawn by the visible distress of their companions. They passed it between them, each woman confronting the photographs in silence. Chiyoko began crying quietly, covering her mouth with her hand. These could have been her neighbors, her cousins, her childhood friends, Japanese civilians dying because their government had fed them propaganda about American demons. More newspapers appeared over the following days, and the women read them all despite the pain they caused. Articles about kamikaze pilots, young men the same age as their brothers, flying suicide missions because they had been taught that death in service to the emperor was the highest honor. Reports about Japanese soldiers fighting to the last man rather than surrender, choosing death over the imagined horrors of American captivity. Estimates of civilian casualties in the massive bombing raids that had devastated Tokyo, Osaka, and dozens of other cities. Private Hayes found Masako sitting alone in the medical facility one evening, staring at her hands. He didn't speak, just sat nearby with the comfortable silence of someone who understood that words couldn't fix everything. After a long while, Masako spoke in her careful English. "We were told you were monsters, that you would torture us, kill us, do terrible things. I believe this completely." Vernon nodded, his young face serious. "Yeah, we were told stuff about you too, that you were all fanatics who'd never surrender, that you didn't value human life the same way we do." He gestured around the medical facility. "Guess both sides lied to make it easier to fight." "But your side's lies didn't kill your own people," Masako said, her voice breaking. "Our lies made civilians jump off cliffs, made soldiers die when they could have surrendered." The photographs from Okinawa haunted the compound for weeks. Conversations among the Japanese women took on a different quality, moving from practical concerns about their own situation to deeper questions about their country's choices and their own complicity. They had been taught that serving the emperor was sacred duty, that Japan's war was defensive and righteous, that their enemies were subhuman monsters deserving of no mercy. Every piece of that narrative was collapsing under the weight of their lived experience. Masako found herself replaying memories from before her capture, examining them through new understanding. She remembered treating wounded American prisoners in the field hospital where she had worked. The Japanese doctors had provided minimal care, seeing these enemies as less deserving of medical attention than their own soldiers. She had accepted this as natural at the time. Now she thought about Dr. Gardner working through the night to save Chiyoko's life, showing no less concern for an enemy prisoner than he would for an American soldier. The contrast was devastating. Hisako grappled with different memories. She had worked in communications, relaying orders and intelligence between units. She had been proud of her efficiency, her attention to detail, her contribution to the war effort. Now she understood she had been a cog in a machine built on lies, helping to coordinate military operations for a cause that had been doomed from the start. She thought about the American abundance she witnessed daily and realized Japan had been fighting an enemy with resources so vast that victory had never been possible. During one of Sergeant Lim's English lessons, Chiyoko asked a question that had been building in all of them. Why do you treat us this way? We are your enemy. We serve the country that attacked you. Why give us good food and medicine? Why teach us your language? Why be kind? Sergeant Lim considered his response carefully, aware that his answer mattered more than simple vocabulary instruction. Because we believe that even enemies are human beings who deserve basic dignity. The war is between governments, not between people. You didn't choose to be soldiers. You were doing what your country told you was right, same as American soldiers do what our country tells us is right. Once you're prisoners, you're no longer enemies. You're just people in a bad situation. The simplicity of this philosophy was almost painful in its contrast to what they had been taught. Japanese military culture emphasized hierarchy, absolute obedience, and the willingness to die rather than face the shame of surrender. The idea that surrender didn't mean disgrace, that prisoners deserved care and respect, that enemies could be seen as fundamentally human, contradicted everything their training had instilled. That evening, Masako wrote in the journal she had been keeping since her capture. She wrote in Japanese, knowing no one would read it, using the privacy to articulate thoughts too complex for her English. She wrote about shame, not for being captured, but for believing lies. June arrived with California heat that reminded the women of summers in Japan, though the dry air felt different from the humidity they remembered. The routines of camp life had become familiar, almost comfortable. The initial tension between guards and prisoners had dissolved into something approaching camaraderie. Conversations mixed English and Japanese freely. Laughter could be heard during mealtimes. The transformation had been so gradual that no one could point to the exact moment when enemies had become something else. Private Vernon Hayes had been watching Masako's growing confidence in the kitchen during Sergeant Lim's cooking lessons. She had progressed from nervous observation to competent execution, but something was missing. Her eggs were technically correct, but lacked the richness he associated with his mother's cooking. One morning, he pulled her aside in the mess hall and demonstrated a technique she hadn't learned yet. "You're being too careful with the butter," he explained, dropping a generous tablespoon into the hot pan. It sizzled and foamed immediately. "Ma always says butter is what makes everything taste like home. Don't be scared of it. Let it get all melty and golden before you add the egg." He cracked an egg into the foaming butter with practiced ease, tilting the pan so the fat pooled around the edges. Masako watched carefully, noticing how the butter transformed the simple process. In Japan, cooking oil was used sparingly due to scarcity. The generous use of butter felt almost wasteful, but she couldn't deny the result. The egg that emerged from Vernon's pan was golden and rich, its edges crispy and delicate. He slid it onto a plate and handed her the fork. "Try it. That's a proper American breakfast egg." The difference was remarkable. The butter added depth and richness she hadn't achieved in her previous attempts. More than that, it represented a fundamental difference in philosophy. American cooking embraced abundance, encouraged generosity with ingredients, celebrated richness rather than austerity. Japanese cooking, especially wartime cooking, had been about making the most of very little. Both approaches had their own beauty, but tasting Vernon's egg made her understand something about American culture she had been missing. "Your mother taught you this?" she asked, her English now fluid enough for casual conversation. Vernon nodded, his freckled face breaking into a smile. "Ma's the best cook in Cedar Rapids. She always said food is how you show people you care about them. When I was little and got sick, she'd make me eggs just like this. Said the butter would help me get strong again." Masako thought about her own mother in Kyoto, wondered if she was still alive, if she had enough food to survive. The contrast between Vernon's childhood memories of abundance and her own memories of careful rationing felt vast, yet here he was, sharing his mother's wisdom with an enemy prisoner, treating her as if she deserved the same care he had received growing up. Over the following weeks, Vernon made it his personal mission to teach Masako every breakfast technique his mother had taught him. How to test if the pan was hot enough by flicking water onto its surface. How to flip eggs without breaking the yolk. How to cook bacon until it was crispy but not burned. How to make toast that was golden all the way through. July brought news that made the entire camp tense with anticipation. Allied forces were closing in on the Japanese home islands. Bombing raids intensified. Naval blockades tightened. The war's end seemed imminent, though no one could predict exactly when or how it would conclude. For the Japanese women, this approaching victory for their captors meant an approaching moment of reckoning. What would happen to them when Japan surrendered? Captain Caldwell began receiving inquiries from Washington about repatriation procedures. The War Department wanted to know how many prisoners were in her facility, their condition, their readiness for return to Japan. She filled out the forms with growing unease, aware that many of her prisoners had no homes left to return to. The addresses they had provided upon capture were in cities that had been bombed flat. Their families were missing or dead. The women discussed their uncertain futures in hushed conversations during free time. Hisako voiced what many were thinking, but few wanted to say aloud. "What kind of Japan will we return to? Our cities are destroyed. Our families are gone. The government that sent us to war has led the country to ruin." She spoke in Japanese, but her voice carried an edge of something that sounded like anger. "We believed their lies. We served their cause. And for what?" Masako had been wrestling with similar thoughts. She had been a loyal servant of the emperor, proud of her military nursing service. But that pride had been built on false foundations. Everything she had believed about the righteousness of Japan's cause had proven false. Everything she had been taught about American brutality had been contradicted by daily experience. Who was she now, stripped of those beliefs? What identity remained when the old one had been revealed as illusion? Chiyoko raised a question none of them wanted to address directly. What if we don't want to go back? The words hung in the air like forbidden thought given voice. To refuse repatriation would be to admit complete abandonment of their country, their culture, their former identities. It would be ultimate betrayal in the eyes of anyone still loyal to Japan's wartime ideology. Yet the idea, once spoken, couldn't be unspoken. Several women nodded slowly, acknowledging the thought they had been suppressing. They had found something in this American prison camp that their own country had never provided. Dignity in work, respect despite defeat, abundance shared without judgment, the freedom to question and grow rather than simply obey. These things were not small gifts. They were fundamental human needs that had been denied them under the rigid military culture they had served. Private Hayes and Sergeant Lim had both noticed the growing anxiety among their prisoners. They couldn't understand the Japanese conversations, but they could read the tension in body language and facial expressions. Hayes mentioned it to Captain Caldwell during a routine briefing. "Ma'am, the women seem really worried about going home. I know that sounds strange, but I think some of them might not want to." The captain had been having similar thoughts. She had watched these women transform over the months from rigid military prisoners into individuals discovering their own capacity for growth and change. August 1st, 1945, 2 weeks before a date that would change world history, though no one in the camp knew it yet. The morning began with an unusual request from Sergeant Lim. He approached Captain Caldwell with a proposal that would have seemed absurd 6 months earlier. He wanted to organize a joint breakfast preparation where American guards and Japanese prisoners would cook together, sharing techniques and traditions. The captain considered the security implications and the potential for criticism if word got out. Prisoners cooking alongside their guards violated standard protocol, but protocol had already been bent considerably in this facility, and the results had been universally positive. She gave approval with the caveat that participation would be voluntary on both sides. No one would be ordered to participate in something so symbolically charged. The response surprised everyone. Nearly all 42 prisoners volunteered, as did a dozen guards. The mess hall became a crowded workshop early that morning, with multiple stations set up for different preparations. Vernon demonstrated his mother's egg technique. Sergeant Lim showed how his family made Chinese-style rice porridge. Masako, with Hisako translating, explained traditional Japanese breakfast preparations, though they lacked many of the necessary ingredients. The barriers of language and culture dissolved in the shared focus on food preparation. Women who had once maintained rigid military bearing laughed as they attempted to flip eggs American style. Guards who had viewed their charges with professional distance discovered individuals with distinct personalities and skills. Chiyoko proved unexpectedly talented at making pancakes, mastering the technique after only 2 attempts. Hisako's precise nature made her excellent at measuring ingredients for biscuits. Dr. Gardner arrived to observe and found himself drawn into the cooking. He had never been particularly skilled in the kitchen, but Masako patiently guided him through making scrambled eggs that didn't turn rubbery. Her teaching style mirrored the patience he had shown her in the medical facility, and the symmetry wasn't lost on either of them. Teacher and student had reversed roles, proof that knowledge and dignity weren't bound by prisoner and captor status. The resulting breakfast was a chaotic feast. American bacon and eggs sat alongside rice balls that Masako had improvised from available ingredients. Pancakes were stacked next to Sergeant Lim's congee. Toast with butter shared table space with pickled vegetables someone had managed to prepare from the camp garden. The meal represented fusion born from necessity and goodwill, neither purely American nor Japanese, but something new created from mutual respect. Captain Caldwell sat with her prisoners and guards, eating food they had prepared together. She thought about the reports she would need to file, the questions she would face from superiors about maintaining proper distance between captors and captives. But watching the easy conversation around the table, seeing genuine smiles on faces that had arrived months ago marked by fear and defiance, she knew something important had been achieved. These women were no longer enemies. They were no longer quite prisoners. They had become something the military had no vocabulary for, people discovering shared humanity across the deepest divide war could create. August 15, 1945. The day began like any other until mid-morning when Captain Caldwell's radio crackled with news that changed everything. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. Victory over Japan Day would be celebrated across America with the same jubilation that had marked victory in Europe 3 months earlier. Church bells would ring. Crowds would fill the streets. Soldiers would kiss strangers in Times Square. But in the small women's facility outside Sacramento, the news brought complicated emotions no celebration could capture. Captain Caldwell called an immediate assembly. The 42 Japanese women gathered in the mess hall with expressions ranging from resignation to dread. They had known this moment was coming, but knowing didn't make it easier. Their country had been defeated. Everything they had been raised to believe about Japanese superiority and inevitable victory had been proven catastrophically wrong. The emperor himself had spoken on the radio, his voice heard by ordinary citizens for the first time, announcing surrender in language so formal many Japanese couldn't fully understand it. The captain stood before them with official documents from the War Department. Her voice was steady but not triumphant. "Ladies, the war has ended. Japan has surrendered unconditionally to Allied forces. Within the next 4 to 6 weeks, you will be processed for repatriation. Ships are being organized to return prisoners of war to Japan. You will be transported to San Francisco, then across the Pacific to processing centers in occupied Japan before being released to return to your homes." The word homes hung in the air with bitter irony. Most of these women had no homes left. Their cities had been bombed. Their families were missing or dead. The Japan they would return to bore no resemblance to the country they had left. It would be occupied by foreign military forces, governed by the same Americans who had defeated them. Everything familiar would be transformed by defeat. Masako felt the room spinning slightly. She had known this was coming, had discussed it endlessly with Hisako and Chiyoko, but the reality was overwhelming. She thought about Kyoto, her childhood home. The city had been spared from bombing due to its cultural significance. But what remained of her family? Her parents would be in their 60s now. Had they survived the war years? Would they even want to see a daughter who had been captured by the enemy? Hisako stood abruptly, her face pale but determined. She spoke in English, her voice clear despite trembling hands. "Captain Caldwell, may I ask questions?" Permission was granted. Hisako looked around at her fellow prisoners before continuing. "What if we do not wish to return immediately? What if some of us wish to remain here longer?" The question landed like a grenade in the assembled group. Several guards exchanged shocked glances. This was unprecedented. Prisoners of war were supposed to want freedom, to long for return to their homeland. The idea that someone would voluntarily choose to remain in enemy captivity after the war ended defied all logic and protocol. Captain Caldwell was momentarily speechless. Her orders covered repatriation procedures, but said nothing about prisoners requesting to stay. She asked for clarification, and what followed revealed the depth of transformation these months had created. Captain Caldwell's office became an impromptu conference room as she tried to understand the unprecedented situation developing in her facility. She had asked Masako, Hisako, and Chiyoko to explain their thinking, hoping to determine if this was a widespread sentiment or isolated confusion. What she discovered was a carefully considered decision that had been building for weeks among a significant portion of her prisoners. Masako spoke first, her English now fluent enough to express complex thoughts. "Captain, we have been writing letters home for months. None of us have received replies. We do not know if our families are alive. We do not know if we have homes to return to. But more than that, we have learned things here that we cannot unlearn. We know now that everything we were taught about America was lies. Everything we believed about our country's righteousness was propaganda." Hisako continued the explanation. "In Japan, if we return now, we will be seen as failures. Soldiers who were captured instead of dying honorably, women who were corrupted by enemy influence. We will face shame and suspicion. But here we have been treated with dignity. We have been given opportunities to work, to learn, to become better than we were. We do not want to lose that." Chiyoko, the youngest, spoke with surprising conviction. "You gave me festival breakfast when I was sick. You cared if I lived or died. Even though I was your enemy, my own country would not have done the same. Japanese military culture would have considered me weak for getting sick, shameful for being captured. You showed me that there is a different way to be human." Captain Caldwell listened with growing understanding. These women weren't refusing repatriation out of fear or cowardice. They were making a conscious choice based on painful realizations about their own society's failures. She explained the legal complexities. Technically, they were still enemy prisoners of war. The Geneva Convention provided for their repatriation, but not for voluntary extended residence. She would need to contact Washington for guidance. The news spread through the compound quickly. By evening, the women had divided into groups based on their intentions. 18 had decided they wanted to request permission to stay in America. They understood the challenges this would present, but felt the risk was worthwhile. The remaining 24 chose to return to Japan, some because they still had hope of finding family, others because duty compelled them, despite uncertainty about what awaited them. The division wasn't hostile. Women who chose differently respected each other's decisions. They had all undergone the same transformation, all confronted the same difficult truths. Their responses simply differed based on individual circumstances and temperaments. Those returning to Japan pledged to carry with them the lessons they had learned about dignity, respect, and the possibility of former enemies becoming friends. Private Hayes sought out Captain Caldwell after learning about the situation. "Ma'am, I know this is complicated, but these women aren't our enemies anymore. Sending them back to nothing seems wrong when they've worked so hard to become part of things here." His simple moral clarity cut through the bureaucratic complexity. The response from Washington took 11 days to arrive. During that time, the camp existed in a strange limbo where the war was over, but nothing had been resolved. The women who wanted to stay lived with daily anxiety that their request would be denied. The women who had chosen repatriation prepared themselves emotionally for return to an unknown Japan. Everyone waited. Captain Caldwell's orders, when they finally came, were surprisingly flexible. The War Department acknowledged the unusual circumstances. Prisoners who wished immediate repatriation would be processed normally. However, those requesting to remain could be reclassified as displaced persons rather than prisoners of war. They would need to find American sponsors willing to provide housing and employment. They would need to apply for immigration status through normal channels. The military would not prevent their staying, but neither would it continue to support them indefinitely. The decision meant the 18 women who wanted to stay faced daunting challenges. They would need to leave the camp within 60 days and establish independent lives in a country that had been their enemy. They would need Americans willing to sponsor former enemy nationals. They would need employment in communities that might still harbor resentment about Pearl Harbor and years of bloody Pacific War. What happened next revealed how completely perceptions had changed. Word of the Japanese women's situation reached the local community through church groups that had been visiting the camp. Mrs. Helen Bancroft, a schoolteacher from Sacramento who had participated in outreach programs, immediately offered to sponsor Masako. She had been impressed by the young woman's intelligence, her rapid mastery of English, and her obvious sincerity about wanting to contribute to American society. Dr. Gardner arranged for Hisako to continue working at the base hospital, then helped her apply for a nursing position at Sacramento General Hospital. Her precise nature and growing medical knowledge made her valuable despite her background. The hospital administrator, a veteran of the Great War who understood something about the aftermath of conflict, agreed to sponsor her immigration application. Other local families stepped forward with similar offers. A couple who owned a flower nursery offered to employ Chiyoko, seeing in her careful attention to detail someone who would excel at horticultural work. The owner's son had died at Guadalcanal, yet his parents chose reconciliation over bitterness. They saw sponsoring a former enemy as a way to honor their son's sacrifice by proving that peace was possible. Within 3 weeks, all 18 women who wanted to stay had found sponsors. The same communities that had initially been suspicious of having Japanese prisoners nearby now embraced the opportunity to participate in what they saw as a uniquely American story. These women represented the possibility that enemies could be transformed, that reconciliation could emerge from conflict, that second chances could lead to redemption. The 9 women who ultimately chose to stay after the full implications became clear began preparing for transition to civilian life. They would leave the camp as free women, but carry with them the weight of complicated histories. September 20th, 1945. The day of departure arrived with California sunshine that seemed inappropriately cheerful for such a bittersweet occasion. The 33 women who had chosen repatriation stood in formation one final time, their posture reflecting months of transformation. They no longer carried themselves with the rigid military bearing of their arrival. Something softer had emerged, a humanity that hadn't been permitted under their previous discipline. The scene bore no resemblance to typical prisoner transfers. American guards embraced women they had come to know as individuals rather than enemies. Sergeant Lim presented each departing prisoner with a small English phrasebook he had compiled, filled with practical vocabulary and expressions of friendship. Private Hayes distributed letters from his mother addressed to the brave Japanese ladies, offering prayers for their safe return and hope for their futures. Captain Caldwell addressed the departing women with words she had labored over for days. "You came here as our enemies, captured in war. You leave as something none of us expected. You leave as friends, as examples of what human beings can become when they choose growth over hatred. I hope you will carry with you not just memories of your time here, but the knowledge that even enemies can discover their shared humanity." Masako stood with the 9 women remaining in America, watching her friends prepare to board the transport vehicles. She had said goodbye to many of these women individually over the past days, but the collective departure felt overwhelming. Hisako stood beside her, tears streaming down her face, as she watched Chiyoko embrace the women who had become her family during captivity. The women boarding the trucks carried more than their few personal possessions. They carried letters from American guards to be delivered to families if possible. They carried photographs from their time at the camp, visual proof that enemies had become friends. They carried recipes written in careful English, techniques for preparing ham and eggs and pancakes that represented more than food. Each recipe was a lesson in abundance, generosity, and the possibility of nourishment beyond mere survival. Most importantly, they carried stories. Stories of unexpected kindness from people they had been taught to hate. Stories of American abundance that had seemed impossible until they witnessed it daily. Stories of being treated with dignity despite defeat. They intended to share these stories in occupied Japan to counter the propaganda that had led civilians to choose death over American capture. One woman, a former communications officer named Fumiko, had asked Captain Caldwell for a letter she could show to other Japanese people. The captain had written a simple statement on official letterhead attesting that these women had been treated humanely according to Geneva Convention standards and had conducted themselves with honor during their imprisonment. Fumiko folded this letter carefully and placed it in her pocket like a talisman against the shame she expected to face upon return. The trucks pulled away slowly, taking 33 women toward an uncertain future in occupied Japan. Those remaining stood watching until the vehicles disappeared from view, then turned to face their own uncertain futures in America. September 1965. Masako Mitchell stood in her kitchen in Sacramento, preparing breakfast with the practiced ease of 2 decades of American life. Her hands moved with confident familiarity as she melted butter in the pan, cracked eggs with perfect precision, and arranged ham slices on a separate griddle. The kitchen smelled of coffee and toast, comfortable morning scents that had become as familiar as breathing. Her daughter Emily, 16 years old with her father's height and her mother's careful attention to detail, set the table while practicing Japanese phrases for her upcoming school presentation. Masako had married Vernon Hayes in 1948, a union that had raised eyebrows initially but proved enduring. He had returned to Iowa to take over his family's farm, and she had become a farm wife who also worked as a translator for the State Department's growing need for Japanese-English communication during the occupation years. Today was special. Masako's mother was visiting from Japan for the first time since the war. The elderly woman had survived the war years in Kyoto, though privation and loss had aged her beyond her years. She sat at the kitchen table now, watching her daughter prepare an American breakfast with an expression mixing wonder and sadness. Masako placed the completed breakfast before her mother. 2 fried eggs with golden yolks, 3 slices of ham, toast with butter melting into its surface, orange juice and coffee with cream. The same festival breakfast that had once seemed impossible, now prepared casually in her own home. Her mother stared at the plate exactly as Masako had stared 20 years earlier in that prison camp mess hall. "Every day?" her mother asked in Japanese, using the same phrase the prisoners had asked the guards. "Americans eat this way every day?" Masako nodded, pouring coffee for herself. "Every day, Oka-san. This is normal here. This is what I tried to tell you in my letters after the war, but I don't think you believed me." Her mother picked up the fork with trembling hands and tasted the eggs. Tears began streaming down her weathered face. "I understand now why you stayed. Not just because of Vernon-san, though he is a good man. You stayed because you found abundance, not just in food, but in how you were treated, in the possibility of becoming someone new." Masako sat across from her mother, watching her eat the breakfast that had changed everything. She thought about that August morning 20 years ago when she had refused to believe such abundance could be real. She thought about Hisako, now Dr. Hisako Yoshida, running the pediatric ward at Sacramento General Hospital. She thought about Chayoko, who owned her own flower shop and had never married, dedicating her life to creating beauty as a form of ongoing apology for the war. She thought about the 33 women who had returned to Japan, many of whom she still corresponded with. They had rebuilt their lives in the ruins, using the lessons learned in American captivity to help reconstruct their country. Several had become leaders in Japanese-American friendship societies.